Hey y'all, I have all 4 of the Glossier bronzers here. I was able to get all 4 colors because I had some store credit at Glossier from people clicking through my link to shop. And I decided to film this video overhead style because I feel like the most important thing that I can do with these is to give you close-up swatches in really good light and comparison swatches to everything that I have in my collection that's even remotely similar to any one of these 4 colors. I also took some B-roll footage of myself applying the lightest shade Flare to my cheeks, so you can see how it looks on me, you can see how it applies, and I'll be talking to you about the formula as well, comparing the formula and the colors to the cloud paints that I have. But most of the video is going to be overhead. If this is your first time to my channel, then welcome. I'm really glad you're here. I'm Hannah. I love beautiful things. I enjoy makeup. I don't always do just straight up reviews of new products. I also like to use my old products. I like using the makeup that I've owned for a really long time. You're going to be seeing some of the makeup that I've owned for a really long time in this video because that's what I'm going to be using to give you some comparison swatches to these colors. So if beauty content like that sounds good to you, meaning like content that's not only about what's new, but that's also about using what you have, if that sounds good to you, I hope that you'll subscribe. And now let's go ahead and get into the meat of this video. Okay, so these are the 2 cloud paints that I own. I have Dusk and Puff. And then Glossier also included in the package, when I ordered these bronzers, they included these cloud paint samples. So I'll be able to, one of them's Dusk and one's Puff, but I'll also be able to compare Storm and Dawn. And then I have all of my blushes and bronzers here. I'm not going to be swatching them all, but I'll be able to go through and dig out anything that seems like it's going to come close to any of these as I'm swatching them. Let's start with Volt. When I saw the marketing imagery of these bronzers, I thought that this was basically going to be a blush, and I was kind of horrified. I was like, Glossier has released 3 tan bronzers and 1 blush rather than 4 shades of bronzer. And then when I saw it and I got it, I was actually surprised by the color. It doesn't look as warm to me in person as it looked in the pictures. Here's a really close-up look at the product on the wand. And there's a really close-up swatch. I was expecting that this in person would really just look like a deep burgundy blush, like a deep berry, shimmery berry blush. Now that I see it in person, I can understand more why they're marketing it as a bronzer or why they chose to make a bronzer this color. I pulled up the Fenty Beauty Sun Stalker bronzers on my computer, and I'm like looking at the screen right now as I'm looking at this swatch. This color is a dead ringer for the color Mocha Miami in the Fenty Beauty Sun Stalker range. So it's the second deepest shade that Fenty came out with in their bronzer range, and it's warm toned. What Glossier did not release is a deep neutral shade. So Mocha Miami by Fenty is described as very deep with warm red undertones, and I'll put a picture of that on the screen right now so you can compare it to the way that this swatch looks. Okay, I keep a pretty edited collection of blush and bronzer, and in fact, to me, blush and bronzer are kind of the same thing. I like a really bronze blush look, and I like a really blushy bronzer look, so I keep everything together, and I tend to just reach for things that are marketed as blushes and things that are marketed as bronzers, and even things that are marketed as contours. So I'm just going to swatch anything that I think might be remotely close in color. And I'm even going to stray a little bit from that. I'm going to swatch things that might be somewhat in the same ballpark in case that's what you have. I'm going to just try to swatch as much as I can so that you can compare the colors of the Glossier bronzers to things that you might have put on your face before or have at home to swatch. Okay, there's the Solar Paint in Volt. And I actually feel like this can make you can see the way that it looks compared to it in the pan. It's not even remotely in the ballpark. I don't think that we need to swatch that. This is the Rituel de Fille Inner Glow Cream Pigment in the shade Eros. It's basically a cool toned brown, so it's much cooler. It's much more taupe than Volt, but it's actually not quite as deep in color as Volt. I don't have very many cheek products that are this deep in color because I myself am so fair. Let's swatch these two creams from the e.l.f. Active Lip and Cheek palette. So there's a warm brown and kind of a berry in the e.l.f. Active Lip and Cheek palette. Here's the warm brown. And there's the berry. This is the shade Spice from Salt New York. And just looking in the pan, it looks like it might be the one that has some undertones that match, but I know that this is a much brighter and more sheer color. I'll go ahead and swatch it anyway. I'm going to try to build it up. So that's Salt New York Spice. This is the Lila B Lip and Cheek Tint in Be Lovely. Yeah, the shade's called Be Lovely. There's the Blush Subtil in Mocha Havana Shimmer. We're really departing from the ballpark at this point. We've like left the ballpark. But I'm going to get some of these bronzy powders down. This is the most bronzy color from this Dior face palette in the shade Glitz. Yeah, also not even in the ballpark. Those might be more relevant swatches next to some of the other Glossier bronzers. But just for the sake of comparison, let's keep going with these. So this is an e.l.f. Putty Blush. And annoyingly, the shade of this is not on the packaging, and I can't remember what shade it is, but I know that I have that information somewhere, so I will look it up. I think it might be Bora Bora, but that could also be totally wrong. I could also be totally wrong. So curiously, it looks kind of similar in the, not super similar, but it looks like it might be close in the pot, but then when it's swatched out, it's definitely a much brighter color. There's Jason Wu Biscotti, much more neutral. There's Patrick Ta, She's So LA, much warmer, much more sheer. This is M Cosmetics Faded Clementine Blush. And this is Melt Blush Light in Sundown. But they're both really warm, kind of bronzy blushes. That's the Merit Blush in Terracotta right there at the bottom. It's also much more pale. And then that right there is the lighter of the two Kjaer Weis bronzers. I always forget the shade name of this Kjaer Weis bronzer. It was a replacement, so the name on the compact doesn't match the product that's inside of it. But Kjaer Weis only makes two shades of bronzer, and this is the lighter of the two shades, the lighter and warmer. So I know that a lot of these aren't even close to being comps for Volt, but again, I wanted to swatch everything that I thought even in anyone's wildest dreams might be remotely in the ballpark so that you can have some perspective, because maybe of these products you own one or you own something that you might be able to compare and kind of like get a sense of the reality of what Volt looks like compared to the thing that you know in real life. The last thing that I'm going to do before I wash these off and go to the next shade is give you a more buffed out swatch. That buffed out swatch is really far away from these other swatches. So I'm just picking up some of Volt where I put it down, and I'm going to buff it out here along the edge so you can really compare it to the other things that I've swatched. So again, there is the buffed out swatch of Volt. There is the berry shade from the e.l.f. Active Lip and Cheek palette. This right here is Lila B Be Lovely. This is Spice from Salt New York right there. And this down here is Jason Wu Biscotti. It's much warmer, but it looks more like the buffed out swatch of Volt than I was expecting it to. And again, this more cool toned, more taupe one right here is Rituel de Fille Eros. Okay, I'm going to leave some of these out because we might want to swatch them again as we move through the other colors. But just to recap with Volt, I've already washed the swatches off, but as you saw, the color of the actual solar paint, the Glossier solar paint in Volt, has more brown in it than, my blushes that are in this realm, like my kind of burgundy and berry blushes. But it's nowhere close to being like that deep neutral shade of bronzer that, for example, is the darkest shade in Fenty's range, Thick Mint. I'll put a picture of Fenty Thick Mint up on the screen. It's much, much more neutral than this. And Glossier just didn't go there with their shade range. Let's look at Heat. Heat is also darker in person than I was expecting it to be based on the advertising imagery from Glossier. I also haven't said this yet because I'm going to talk about the formula later, but they're much less shimmery than I was expecting them to be based on the advertising imagery. So based on the pictures on the Sephora website, this looks to me like Cocoa Naughty in the Fenty Beauty bronzer range. The Fenty listing says that Cocoa Naughty is deep with neutral undertones, and this actually also looks a bit warm to me. It doesn't look as red toned as Volt, but it does look warm. I wouldn't necessarily call this neutral. Especially when it's buffed out, you're gonna get that warmth. You're gonna get that almost blushy warmth. Buffed out, you can see that it has some sheen. When it's on the cheeks, it definitely looks, it's like the sheen not of a highlighter or of a luminous blush, but of a matte product applied over a luminous primer. So I feel like it's sort of a blended into the skin kind of sheen, but none of these are as highlighting as I was expecting them to be. Okay, here I have some comparisons, and I actually do have some products that are comparable in color to the way that Heat looks when it's blended out. Although none of my comparable products could be built up to the level of depth that you can build this up to. And most of mine are peachier as well. I think that the Rituel de Fille is obviously still the most cool toned of everything that I have. But I think that after that, Heat is going to be the least peachy. Like, this is definitely the least peachy of everything that's here. That's the Rituel de Fille Cream Pigment in Eros. Then I think that Heat is probably the second least peachy. And these four are, I think that probably this is Patrick Tashi Soleil. What's this? This is the swatch from the e.l.f. Active Lip and Cheek, the brown. That's the third least peachy. And then Patrick Tashi Soleil, which is down here, the Kjaer Weis bronzer, which is right there, and this is Biscotti from Jason Wu right there. They're all more peachy. None of them is exactly quite peach. You know what I mean? They're all kind of like a bronzy color, but they're peachier than Heat, and they're all much peachier than the Inner Glow Cream Pigment. So just to go through the list again, in case you kind of lost track of which one was which, on the top we have a thick swatch of Glossier Solar Paint in Heat. The second one down is a buffed out swatch of Glossier Solar Paint in Heat. The third one down is this Kjaer Weis bronzer. It's the lightest of the Kjaer Weis bronzers. The fourth one down is Biscotti, which is the Jason Wu Hot Fluff. The fifth one down is the Inner Glow Cream Pigment in the shade Eros. The sixth one is the brown from the e.l.f. Active Lip and Cheek palette. And on the bottom, we have the cream blush from Patrick Ta She's So LA. Let's take a look at Ray. This looks really orange to me. And I'm someone who doesn't really like blushes that lean orange, and I like things to be more neutral. So I feel like this is the one that has the most yellow in it of all of them. The other ones are kind of getting their warmth from more of a red undertone. And this one seems to have more of a yellow or orange undertone. Yeah, it has that kind of camel color. Okay, so there we have a thick swatch of Glossier Solar Paint in Ray, and we have a more buffed out swatch. So I kind of want to know what it looks like next to M Cosmetics Faded Clementine Blush. The blush is peachier, and it doesn't have that like camel undertone. Here's the Melt Blush Light in Sundown. It's also got more of like a gold, almost like a NARS Orgasm, like gold and peach. So this is more yellow than that kind of thing. Maybe more like this bronzy highlighter from Dior. Even this bronzy highlighter from the Dior Glitz palette is looking more peach than the Solar Paint. And yeah, I can guarantee that Jason Wu Biscotti, oh yeah, it looks positively pink. It looks positively mauve by comparison. Let's look at Merit's Terracotta Blush. Also looking really peach by comparison. Maybe the e.l.f. I bet this e.l.f. blush is gonna be the closest dupe. That's definitely the closest dupe that I have, but it's also warmer. It's also warmer and peachier in undertone. I love this blush when I really, really sheer it out. I really like wearing that as a blush. And I am probably not going to be able to get Ray to work for me like that because it's got that really kind of camel-y, yellowy undertone. I think this is one that I probably won't be able to wear. And just for good measure, here's Patrick Ta She's So LA. Although we already know that that's going to be more on the peachy side. And let's check it out next to the Kjaer Weis bronzer. So again, in case you've lost track of which swatch is which, the top swatch here is the Kjaer Weis bronzer. The second one is the brown from the e.l.f. Active Lip and Cheek palette. The third one is the thick swatch of Glossier Solar Paint in Ray. The fourth one is the buffed out swatch of Ray. The fifth swatch here is M Cosmetics Faded Clementine Blush. The sixth one is the Melt Blush Light in the shade Sundown. And the next one underneath that is the bronzy shade from the Dior Face Palette in Glitz. This cream swatch right here is Jason Wu Biscotti. Then we have the Merit Blush in Terracotta. And lastly, the cream from Patrick Ta She's So LA. I don't own any cheek products with as warm and kind of camel-y an undertone as Ray. And that might be because I don't own very many bronzers, and the ones that I do tend to lean quite peachy because when I get sun, I get peachy. Lastly, let's look at Flare. To me, it looks tan. And it does look like it has a little bit of opaque, milky pigment in it. All right, we definitely want to swatch this next to the lightest shade of Contour from Salt New York. It's actually kind of similar. Yeah, that's actually a pretty good comp. I feel like the Salt New York shade is more neutral. You can see when you compare them that Flare from Glossier is leaning just a little bit on the warm, like a little bit on the peachy side. But those are very close. Let's also look at Merit Terracotta with this. Much peachier. I feel like we're going to run into the same thing that we did with the other shade. It's like everything's going to be slightly peachier. There's Jason Wu Biscotti. It's definitely deeper. But the only thing that I can think of on site that this reminds me of that I own is Glossier DUSK. So I feel like we should skip right to swatching these solar paints all next to each other and swatching them next to the Glossier cloud paints. But just a quick recap, here we have Glossier solar paint in Flare swatched thickly, Glossier solar paint and Flare buffed out. The lightest shade of contour from Salt, New York. I can't remember what the shade name is, but I'll definitely link it down below. Here we have Merit blush in Terracotta. This is Jason Wu Biscotti, and this is the cream blush from Patrick Ta, She's So LA. You know what else I want to swatch next to this though? Clinique Nude Pop. I feel like for some people this is sort of like the standard, very, very pale cheek. But it is much pinker. It's much pinker than Glossier Flare. Interesting. Very interesting. All right, I'm going to clean all of this up and we'll get to swatching the Glossier cream products all next to each other. So on top there is the Glossier Cloud Paint in Storm, and underneath it is the Glossier Solar Paint in Volt. And there's Dawn, which is nothing like any of these, but just as a point of reference. Puff is also not really like any of these. But there it is. Okay, so here we have Cloud Paint in Puff on top, Cloud Paint in Dawn, Cloud Paint in Storm. Then we have all four of the bronzers. So Volt, Heat, Ray, and Flare. And then on the bottom, Glossier Dusk, which looks a lot less like Flare than I was expecting it to. It's just definitely much peachier. There's Storm blended out, that's the Glossier Cloud Paint, and there's Volt, the solar paint blended out. I want you to just blend them both out a little bit because I feel like that's one of the things that I thought when I saw the imagery of the release. I saw Volt and I was like, that looks just like Glossier Storm, but maybe with a little bit of shimmer in it. Blending them out, you can kind of see the difference in the tones. And then there's the same thing with Glossier Cloud Paint in Dusk and Glossier Solar Paint in Flare. So you can see that once again, Dusk, it's just, you know, it's more of a blush color. It's more pink, and Flare is more orange. And while we're at it with Flare, let's go ahead and talk about application, and I'll roll the footage of myself applying Flare to my cheeks this morning. It applies flawlessly. I mean, the Glossier Cloud Paint is one of my all-time favorite makeup formulas. It's truly flawless to me. And I think that, I think what they did was that they just put a tiny bit, just a tiny, tiny bit of shimmer. Again, I don't think of these as like highlighting bronzers or glowy bronzers really. They just buff out with a little bit of a sheen, almost as if you've applied them over a glowy primer. I think they just put a little bit of sheen into the Cloud Paint formula and came up with 4 new colors and called it a day, or called it a bronzer, called it a solar paint. To me, they feel and apply and buff out exactly like Glossier Cloud Paint, and that makes me think that they are exactly like Glossier Cloud Paint, which is great. Like, that's fine with me. I'm glad that that's what they did. That's what I would have hoped that they would do. I like to apply cloud paint with a brush, so that's what I did. You'll see in the footage that I buffed it out. You'll see the sheen. It has a pretty decent sheen, but again, it's not something you can see from space. They look and feel and apply to me kind of like a cross between a matte and a glowy cheek. Like, I feel like it ends up being more of a satin look and less of a glowy look. Whereas again, from all of the marketing imagery, I was led to believe that we were going to get a really, really glowy cheek from this. With regards to the color of Flare, which is, definitely the one of the 4 that suits me best, it still looks kind of orange on me, I think. You'll be able to see that in the footage. I personally prefer Dusk. For me, I feel like Dusk is my ideal bronzer color. And I would love it if they made a shade lighter in the solar paint that had a little bit more warmth to it and also had the slight shine. That would be like my perfect cream bronzer. The shade range is limited, as Glossier's shade ranges often are, especially when they first launch. If you're like me and you're very pale and you like a slightly rosy bronzer, like a blushy bronzer, then there's not really going to be something here for you. I would actually recommend Dusk instead. And if you have very dark skin and you prefer a neutral bronzer rather than something very, very red toned, then there's not something here for you either. In the in-between, between the kind of like warm ruddiness of heat and the very camel colored sort of like yellow undertone of Ray, I would hope that these 2 shades can cover quite a wide range of people who fall in the middle. But when it comes to the lightest shade and the deepest shade, they definitely went all in on a single undertone. So I feel like they went all in on kind of an orangey undertone for the lightest shade, or like a tan, like a beigey, tanny orange. And they really went all in on a very red undertone for the deepest shade. The formula is very good, which makes me hope that they will expand the shade range in the future, because it would be lovely to see something comparable, for example, to Thick Mint from Fenty in this formula. As a very pale person, I can get Dusk and I can mix it with Flare and I can kind of like get that blushy bronzer that I prefer. But if you have deep skin and you don't want something super red toned, then there isn't an option for you. And that sucks. That is it. That's everything that I can do. I know that I don't have all that much to compare these to. Again, I try to keep a bit of an edited collection myself. So when it comes to giving like comprehensive swatch comparisons for an entire range of bronzer like this, I can only go so far. I can only do so much. I hope that this was helpful for you. Thank you so much for being here. And don't forget to take extra good care of yourself, because that's what'll make you the most effective version of yourself as you do your work in the world.